Hello, my name is Alfredo Salmon Mujage from Educare, Tanzania. Welcome in this session to proceed with our topic, which is the fourth topic in Form 5 history, and it is so called from colonialism to First World War. Africa from colonialism to First World War. So we are proceeding with our topic. On the last session we ended on the measure that indicated that colonial states was violent. So now we are going to see the factors which determined the introduction of different systems of agriculture in the colonies. The factors that determined the introduction of different agricultural systems in the colonies. So, as I told you that our topic has two subtopics, so now we are going to see the second subtopic, which is the establishment of various agricultural systems in colonies. So let us see the factors which determined the introduction of different systems of agriculture in the colonies. The first one, or the first factor, was dense population made it difficult for the land alienation to be practiced. It means that dense population make difficult for land alienation to be practiced. Settler and plantation agriculture was impossible to develop, thus peasant agriculture was reinforced. It means that the dense population made difficult for land alienation, so the settler and the plantation agriculture was impossible to be established or to be developed, and that led to the establishment of peasant agriculture. Another was centralized and strong kingdoms were preferred for indirect rule and peasant economy rather than settler and plantation system were introduced. It means that the areas or African areas that are the centralized and the strong kingdoms were preferred to introduce indirect rules by the colonialists, and they preferred to establish peasant economy rather than settler and the plantation systems. These kingdoms proved to be on the establishment of settler agriculture. In this regard, peasant agriculture was introduced. The notable examples are Uganda and northern Nigeria. It means that the areas which are the centralized and strong kingdoms like Uganda and northern Nigeria were the areas where settler and plantation could not be taking place or could not take place because there were strong and centralized kingdoms, and that led to the establishment of peasant and not plantation or settler agricultural system. Another was different governors preferred peasant agriculture. It means that the different governors, it means that there was the exchanging or the changing of governors. So there are some governors who preferred peasant agriculture. There are some governors who preferred settler or plantation. For example, Al Johnston of Uganda and Governor Olas Biat and Sir Donald were the governors who preferred peasant agriculture. Donald Cameron of Tanganyika preferred peasant agriculture. It means that there are some governors who preferred peasant agriculture, like Al Johnston of Uganda, and the governors Olas Biat and Sir Donald Cameron of Tanganyika preferred peasant agriculture. Another was territorial and nationality problems. It means territorial and nationality problems. Before 1919, Tanganyika was ruled by Germans, but after the First World War, it was ruled by the British. Disagreements appeared regarding various issues of administration and the creation of settler economy, of settler colony. Thus, peasant agriculture dominated in many parts of Tanganyika. It means that territorial and nationality problems. For example, before 1919, Tanzania was ruled by Germans, but after the Second World War, the British government controlled over Tanganyika. And that's why they decided to use peasant agriculture to dominate in Tanganyika. Another factor that determined the establishment of our agricultural system was there was always a labor supply problem when the economy favored only one crop. It means that the presence of labor supply, or the presence of labor supply problem when the economy favored only one crop. It means that in some areas there was the problem of supply of labor, whereby the nature of the area could support the only one crop. Another was the nature of the crops. It means the nature of the crops. There are some regions which could not support the planting of some cashew crops. Certain crops such as cotton, coffee, and cocoa needed great care and could not be mixed easily with other systems of agriculture. So that's why they were planted in areas that could support the growth of these cash crops. Another was climate condition, or climatic condition was another factor that determined the establishment of agricultural system. Some areas were thought to be unfit for the European settlement as far as climate condition was concerned. It means that the climate condition determined what agricultural system could be established. For example, there are some areas which could not fit for the Europeans to be settling there. For example, in Uganda and Nigeria, those areas which have the high temperature, and due to the high temperature, the Europeans or white people could not settle in that area freely. So in these areas, peasant agriculture was encouraged. The climate condition which could not support the settlement of the Europeans. Another, it is in case for mandate territories after the World War after the World War II, colonies would be granted independence. It means in case of mandate territories after the Second World War, colonies would be granted independence. So therefore no settler could be invited because they were preparing for majority rule. Therefore no settler could be invited because those countries which were under mandate territory were prepared for majority rule. The notable example are Tanganyika and the Cameroon. These were countries which were under the mandate territories which were prepared to get their self-independence. And the last one was soil fertility, favored plantation agriculture to cultivate different crops. It means that the areas which are the fertile land or fertile soil favored plantation and settler agriculture, which could provide the nutrients for the cultivation of different crops. Hence, plantation agriculture encouraged, for example, Morogoro in Tanganyika. So that were areas which had the fertile or fertile soil that could support plantation agriculture to be introduced. After looking at the factor that favored or determined the establishment of agricultural system in the colonies, Let us see colonial economy and social services after the Second World War. The colonial economy and social services after the Second World War. The colonial economy. What is the colonial economy? By the end of the 19th century, European powers had already suppressed the African resistance and extended their rule almost throughout the entire continent. It means that by the end of 19th century, European powers had already suppressed the African resistance and extended their territories almost throughout the whole continent. The countries that were subjected to colonial rule by this time were Ethiopia and Liberia. It means that the countries which were not colonized during that time were Ethiopia and Liberia. Colonial economies were established in Africa over a span of years. It means that colonial economies were established in Africa over a certain period of time or a certain period of years. During that period, African self-sufficient economic were transformed and made inferior. It means that during that period, African self-sufficient economy was distracted and to make it inferior. The colonialists reorganized the traditional African societies to meet their selfish or self-interest. It means that the colonialists come up to remake or to reorganize the traditional African societies in order to meet the interests of the colonialists. The colonial economy refers to the production and consumption patterns that existed in Africa during the colonial period. It means the colonial economy or the economy of colonialists refers to the production and consumption pattern that existed in Africa during the colonial period. The colonial economy was imposed on the Africans. It means that the colonial economy was imposed on Africans and with the specific objectives. Among of the specific objectives were like analyze agricultural policies and the strategies undertaken to improve agricultural production in the colonies during and after Second World War. It means that the among of the specific objective of the colonialists or to the colonials to establish colonial economy was to analyze agricultural policies and the strategies to be undertaken to improve agricultural production in the colonies during and after the Second World War. And the second one was to analyze the various development schemes undertaken in the colonies. The third one was to explain the objectives of introducing progressive or master farmers. And the last one was to discuss the reasons for introducing cooperatives and the marketing boards. These were the specific objectives which the colonialists intended to meet after the introduction of colonial economy. Let us see the objectives of the colonial economy. What were the objectives of colonial economy? There are various economic reasons that made the colonial powers to establish the colonial economy in Africa, and these are the following. The first one, or the first objective of introduction of colonial economy, was the need for markets. By the late 19th century, the industries in Europe were producing more industrial goods than Europeans could consume. Industrialists encouraged their governments to undertake colonization in Africa in order to protect the markets for the industrial goods. It means that by the late of 19th century, many European countries developed in industry, and many countries produced enough or more industrial goods than European demands or Europeans' demands, and that industrialists encouraged their respective governments to undertake or to find another alternative for protecting the markets of their products. That's why the European countries decided to come in Africa to colonize the African continent in order to protect the markets for their industrial goods. Also, there was overproduction in Europe where their goods were unmarketable. It means that in Europe there was overproduction of industrial goods and were unmarketable. So the main alternative, they were decided to come in Africa to find market for their surplus goods or products. The colonial powers were looking for area where they can sell their manufactured goods. It means that the colonialists were looking for areas where they can get, or they could get the area where they could sell their manufactured goods. Another reason was, or another objective was, need for raw materials. They were looking for cheap labor, for cheap raw materials such as cotton, minerals, and others. To mean that the colonialists, or the another objectives that led to the establishment of colonial economy was the need for raw materials. To mean that the colonialists were looking for cheap raw materials such as cotton and the minerals, where they took minerals in Africa to European industries. It means that the Europeans were taking the minerals from, or raw materials from Africa to European industries, and the colonial power were establishing processing industries in Africa so that they can process material before they took to their countries. It means that the colonialists, what they decided to do was introducing the processing industries in Africa so that they can process those raw materials before they took to their industries in European countries. Example, cotton and sisal. There was introduction of processing industries that could process cotton and sisal to reduce the burden of taking the unwanted parts of those products to Europe. In the 19th century, experiencing the Industrial Revolution, so they needed industrial production like mode of production, which included human resources, capital resources, and the natural resources. And thus, European industries were dependent on raw materials from Asia, America, and Africa. It means that the European industries were dependent much on raw materials from Africa, America, and Africa. They needed raw materials to feed their industries in Europe. Example, cotton, it means that they needed raw materials in order to feed their hungry industries in Europe. They were looking for cheap raw materials because in Europe they had been exported and the remaining ones were quite expensive. It means that in Europe there were exhaustion of those raw materials, and those which were remained were at expensive, or they had high price, so they could not afford the production cost that could be compared to the profit which were intended to be maximized. So that's why they decided to come in Africa and introduce the colonial economy in order to get the raw materials for their industries. But another objective was need for investment. It means the Europeans wanted the area where they can invest their surplus capital. They need to get investment areas. They had large capital which made them unable to sell their products. There was high population in Europe and shortage of rent. Rich people were controlled land where poor people become landless. It means that in Europe there were high population, so there was shortage of rent, whereby the rich people were controlling the land and the poor people become landless. That's why they decided to look for areas where they could invest their excess capital. They could not invest in Europe because the markets were saturated. So they decided to come in Africa and to invest their surplus or excess capital in order to invest their excess capital that they could not be invested in Europe because the markets were saturated. Another was the need for cheap labor. It means that they introduced the colonial economy in Africa in order to get the cheap labor. They needed cheap labor. It means that industrial revolution in Europe introduced the new machine which replaced the human labor. After abolition of slave trade, the colonial powers were searching for cheap labor. It means that after the abolition of slave trade, the human labor was replaced by the machines. And after the Industrial Revolution, so the some people in Europe were searching, or colonial power were searching for cheap labor, which could be used in production that will make them to maximize profit and ensure there is less cost in production, but the profit is high. Labor was expensive in Europe because the workers were demanding for high wages. It means that the laborers in Europe were at large. It means the laborers in Europe were expensive and the workers were demanding for high wages to be paid. These motives clearly show that the colonial powers established the colonial economy not to save the Africans, but to satisfy their own selfish interests or self-interest. So until there, you can see that these all motives or reasons or objectives which were triggered to the establishment of colonial economy, the colonialists were intended to save their interests and not for the benefits of Africans. So these were the objectives of establishment of colonial economy in Africa. So let us see the characteristics of the colonial economy. What were the characteristics of colonial economy? The first one was export-import oriented. It means that export-import oriented. It means that there was production of raw materials which must be exported to the metropolitan, and the importation of industrial manufactured goods from Europe to Africa. So it was just like exchanging. The Africans are the producers of raw materials and the Europeans are the producers of the ready manufactured goods or finishing goods from the industries. The colonial economies were export oriented because they were based on the export of raw materials, both minerals and the agricultural, and the importation of manufactured goods from Europe to Africa. So that's why colonial economy was called or was characterized or could be termed as the export-import oriented. Another was monoculture economy. It means that the colonial economies were specialized in the production of the major commodity. For example, Mauritius specialized in the production of sugar, Ghana, Zambia, and Zaire in cocoa, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. It means that the colonial economy was specialized in the production of the major commodity which was in need or in high or in large demand in Europe. So that's why, for example, in Mauritius specialized in the production of sugar, while in Ghana, Zambia, and Zaire, or by present time so-called DRC, or Democratic Republic of Congo, specialized in production of cocoa. While, Ghana, Zambia, and Zaire in cocoa, and now Democratic Republic of Congo specialized in the production of copper. It means that Mauritius specialized in the production of sugar, Ghana, Zambia, and Zaire were specialized in the production of cocoa, and DRC or Democratic Republic of Congo specialized in the production of copper. That was so-called monoculture economies. It means every colony was specialized in the production of major commodity. Another characteristic of colonial economy was manufacturing sector was small and weak. It means manufacturing sector was small and weak, or industrial sector was small and weak. The manufacturing sector was small and weak because the colonial powers discouraged the establishment of heavy manufacturing industries in Africa. It means that the manufacturing industries in Africa was small and weak because the colonial powers discouraged the establishment of heavy manufacturing industries in Africa, because if Africa had the heavy manufacturing industries, would be act as the obstacle in the competition of market. So that's why they made Africa to remain producer of raw materials and market for European manufacturing goods. The fewer industries that were established were semi-processing industries that aimed at reducing the weight of raw materials to facilitate their exportation to Europe. It means that some of the industries which were established were semi-processing industries that could reduce the weight of raw materials, to reduce the unwanted materials from those raw materials, in order for them to be easy to export those raw materials to Europe. Another was production was based on coercion or coercive equipments. It means that the production was based on coercion. The colonial economy was imposed on the Africans, and they were forced to produce for the export market rather than their own consumption. Consequently, there was no time to produce food, which led to frequent famine in Africa. Another was exploitation. It means that colonial economy was exploitation or exploitative in nature, whereby we can see exploitation in many aspects, like land alienation. It means that the land of Africans were taken by the colonialists to establish plantations. But in another was taxation. The colonial economy was characterized by taxation or introduction of taxes, such as the poll and art taxes in Kenya, which was introduced the indirect way of getting labor. To get money to pay the taxes, the Africans had to sell their labor, thus the colonialists got both cheap labor and the cash crops. Another was, as I've told you, these were the characteristics of colonial economy, which was introduced by the colonialists in Africa. So until there, this is the end of our lesson. After looking the characteristics of colonial economy in Africa, let us see the exercise which you have to perform. It comprises the two questions. The first one is explain the features of colonial economy, and the second one, analyze the factors that determine the establishment of agricultural system in Africa during colonial system or during colonial economy. So until there, this is the end of our lesson. I would like to thank you for listening me and watching until the end. Thank you for learning with us. I welcome you to participate and to watch Educare Tanzania lessons and teachings. I wish you the good time.